The spring of 1985 in the eastern Sayan Mountains began with anticipation of the tourist gatherings that brought together students from all over the Soviet Union. These hiking tours were an excellent opportunity for young people not only to showcase their skills, but also to improve their qualifications, complete routes, and simply socialize with like-minded peers. The groups of participants prepared thoroughly for these events, gathering gear and preparing themselves physically and mentally. However, not everything went according to plan. By April 27, the organizers faced an unexpected problem. The number of participants wishing to join was greater than expected, and there were not enough buses to transport all the students to the routes. This caused dissatisfaction among the participants, especially the beginners, who had hoped to prove themselves in the upcoming trials. The organizers decided to allow only the most prepared groups, consisting of experienced hikers, to participate. The rest were asked to go home. This decision sparked outrage among many students. They had prepared for the hike, packed their backpacks, and arranged time off from their studies, only to be told that they wouldn't be going on the trip. No one wanted to return home after all the preparations, so a group of students decided to organize their own wild hike. Without leaders or instructions, a group of 22 people set off into the mountains independently, despite the lack of registration with rescue services and the absence of approval from the Route Qualification Commission. They chose Bhabha Peak, a small mountain in the eastern Sayans, standing 2,061 meters high. While the Hamar Daban Range is not the tallest, it is known for its rapidly changing weather and challenging conditions, which could surprise even experienced hikers. However, for the beginners it seemed like a good start, as the mountain appeared accessible for a training ascent. Confident in their abilities, the students took a train to Slayudanka, from where they caught a bus to the base of the mountains. The weather at the start of the route was favorable for their plans. It was sunny and cool, with a gentle breeze brushing the slopes, and everything seemed as though the ascent would be easy and quick. The group hiked energetically, climbing the trails with enthusiasm. Their confidence in their abilities and their desire to prove their independence drove them forward. No one thought about potential risks. The goal seemed so close, and the day had just begun. In the end, no one had any doubts that this would be an easy hike, but Hamar Daban, known for its treacherous weather, was already preparing its deadly surprise. On the third day of their hike, May 3, the students decided to ascend Bhabha Peak. Although the mountain was not particularly tall, the group was excited. 3 people stayed behind in the camp, not feeling well enough for the climb. The remaining 19 set out early in the morning, gathering the necessary gear and beginning their ascent. The weather that day was perfect, around 10 degrees Celsius, sunny with a light breeze. No one anticipated how quickly that picture would change. The group moved in an organized fashion, although there was no clear briefing. The novice hikers followed the more experienced members of the group, such as Mikhail Mikhailov, Alexei Potapeko, and Alexander Yepin. They set the pace and trajectory for the climb. As they ascended, the mood in the group remained positive. Some joked, others sang songs, enjoying the scenery. By around 1, Zeropem, the first members of the group, Mikhailov and Vaikhatsev, reached the summit. The last participants arrived by 1:40 p.m. Once the entire team was at the peak, they took a short break. They took photos, ate chocolate, and chatted. Everyone felt a sense of accomplishment, and that success lay ahead. The group spent about 3 hours at the summit, enjoying their achievement and leaving notes about their climb on chocolate wrappers. As they had no paper on hand, they wrote a humorous message, noting that 19 parachutists successfully landed on Bhabha Peak. Afterward, they began their descent. However, instead of descending the same route they had taken to ascend, the group made a different decision. They decided to go through the pass to leave another note there. This was a mistake. None of the participants knew that this new path held hidden dangers. The descent turned out to be much more difficult than the students had anticipated. The first warning sign appeared shortly after they started moving down. The snow began to get deeper, in some places reaching their knees. Although the students were equipped, the situation became more complicated. The group slowed down, and their steps became more labored as they sank deeper into the snow. Nevertheless, despite the increasing difficulty, they continued. The first few participants, Potapeko, Zoran, and Koryakov, kept their distance and led the way, trying to find a more suitable path. However, the farther they went, the more they had to struggle with the snow. The group began to descend lower to avoid the deep snowdrifts, but this only worsened the situation. The snow became even deeper, and each step required enormous effort. By around 3:00 p.m., when the group was already far from the summit, Yepen, one of the leaders, suddenly shouted, "Avalanche!" In that instant, the snow beneath the students' feet shifted sharply and everything started to move downhill. The avalanche began suddenly and swiftly. A massive wall of snow started to carry everything in its path. Those at the front tried to warn the others, but had no time to take action. All the students were caught in a deadly trap. The avalanche struck the group with terrifying speed. It all happened within seconds. There was no time for anyone to react or attempt a rescue. The students in the front only had time to shout a warning about the impending danger before they were swallowed by a powerful mass of snow. Alexander Potapeko, who was leading the group, managed to jump behind a rock by sheer luck, which shielded him from the avalanche. He watched as everything collapsed before his eyes. The suddenly towering snow wall swept away all his companions, carrying them down the slope. Potapeko could hear screams, but soon everything fell silent. The snow had swallowed everyone and everything. The avalanche was so powerful that it instantly buried most of the group. Those who were at the back were buried deeper, while a few were thrown onto the surface. Realizing what had happened, Potapeko immediately rushed down to try and save his friends. Galina Mishurina was one of the few who were lucky enough to remain on the surface. The avalanche only brushed against her, throwing her onto the upper layer of snow. Her clothes were soaked, but she remained conscious. Galina felt it was hard to breathe. The snow chilled her face and penetrated her clothing, but she hadn't been buried like her companions. Potapeko quickly dug her out, and together they began to search for the others. The remaining 17 people were completely buried under the snow. Without special equipment or experience in rescue operations, Potapeko and Mishurina had almost no chance of digging out their friends. The avalanche had left a deadly snow cone stretching for hundreds of meters. A safe rescue seemed impossible. Everything around them was frozen in eerie silence. When the avalanche subsided, a deadly stillness enveloped the area. Only the howling wind and the muffled cries of the few survivors broke the silent landscape. Alexander Potapeko, the only one to avoid being buried, quickly assessed the situation. His first impulse was to try to find someone from the team, but the snow was dense and hard, like cement. Potapeko found Galina Mishurina, who had remained on the surface. She was not seriously injured, but was in shock. Together, they tried to dig through the snow, hoping to find other members of the group. However, after several minutes of desperate efforts, it became clear that the avalanche had buried their companions too deep. The snow dust still lingered in the air, settling on their faces. Potapeko knew that the chances of finding anyone alive were diminishing by the minute. Without avalanche equipment, they had no way of digging deep enough. Without avalanche probes and special shovels, their efforts were almost futile. They could only hope for a miracle. The situation was complicated by the fact that the group had no clear plan for such emergencies. There had been no avalanche safety briefing, and the avalanche cords, which should have been trailing behind the hikers, remained in their pockets. No one knew how to act properly. Panic and shock gripped both Galina and Alexander, but they understood that no one would come to help for hours, maybe even days. Realizing that they couldn't save the rest on their own, Potapikeko decided to descend to call for help. He and Galina knew that time was running out and that a rescue operation had to start as soon as possible if their comrades were to have any chance of survival. After the avalanche, Potapikeko understood that their chances of saving the others were minimal without external assistance. He needed to descend as quickly as possible and summon rescuers. With every passing minute, the odds of his comrades' survival were dwindling. Despite the horror of what had happened, Alexander gathered all his strength and quickly made the decision. He and Galina decided to descend the slope, but the path they had taken was now dangerous and altered by the avalanche. The snow beneath their feet was loose and treacherous. They moved slowly, fearing that another avalanche might occur. With each step, the air grew colder, and even the once warm morning sun no longer provided any heat. Potapikeko was an experienced hiker, but descending under such dangerous conditions was a serious test for him. Galina, following behind him, barely spoke, her state approaching shock. They walked together across the vast snowy field, leaving behind the terrifying snow cone that buried their 17 comrades. The silence that surrounded them was almost unbearable. Every step felt endless. Galina thought about how just hours earlier they had climbed Bhabha Peak, joking and laughing, and now only the two of them were left alive. The descent took several hours. When they finally reached a safe spot, Alexander immediately contacted the nearest tourist base, reporting what had happened. There was a tense air of fear. Would the rescuers arrive in time? Both of them understood that the weather could change at any moment, complicating the rescue efforts. Potapikeko felt his strength waning, but he had to hold on for the sake of those still trapped under the snow. The news of the disaster spread quickly, and within a day, the first rescue team arrived at the scene. These were experienced hikers and mountaineers who knew that saving those buried by the avalanche would be extremely difficult. They understood that with every passing minute, the chances of survival were decreasing, but no one was willing to give up. The rescue operation began early in the morning when a helicopter delivered the first group of rescuers to the site of the avalanche. Alexander Potapikeko led them to the place where the tragedy had occurred. By that time, the avalanche had already hardened. The snow was dense, and the temperature continued to drop. Galina Micharina remained at the camp as she needed rest and medical attention. The rescuers, armed with probes and avalanche shovels, began probing the snow in places where they believed the buried tourists might be. Every strike of the probe against the snow echoed in the hearts of each rescuer. They hoped for a miracle, but understood that too much time had passed. The first body was found by evening that same day. It was one of the group members buried at a depth of about 3 meters. The rescuers didn't show it, but each of them felt the weight of what was happening. With each body they found, the hope that anyone had survived grew fainter. Over the next 2 weeks, the rescuers continued their work despite the unfavorable conditions. The weather worsened, the wind intensified, and snow began to fall again. But the work went on. No one wanted to leave their comrades behind in the mountains, even if their bodies were frozen in the snow. The search continued, but with each passing day, hope faded. The rescuers, working until they were completely exhausted, kept finding the bodies of the hikers, one after another, but no survivors. Nevertheless, they persisted, clinging to the thought that at least one person might still be alive in this deadly snow trap. But with every body they uncovered, that belief became increasingly elusive. The atmosphere at the scene of the tragedy was eerie. The hope that had fueled the early stages of the rescue operation gradually gave way to a heavy sense of inevitability. Every strike of the shovel against the snow reverberated across the slope, and every body they found was met with a mixture of sadness and resignation. the rescuers understood that with every passing hour, the chances of finding anyone alive diminished. Among the bodies found, none showed the typical positions of people who had tried to save themselves. Most of them were discovered in positions that indicated instantaneous death from suffocation or hypothermia. The conditions of the avalanche and its speed left the victims no chance to fight back. Furthermore, there were no air pockets or attempts to dig out, which only confirmed the theory that the avalanche had buried them too quickly. The air temperature continued to drop, and the rescuers' work became increasingly difficult. The bodies of the victims were deeply frozen in the snow, and each time they were found, it took time for them to thaw enough to be safely lifted to the surface. However, the conditions were so harsh that even this often had to be done on the verge of the possible. The stark contrast between the lively young people who had climbed the peak just days before, full of enthusiasm and plans, and those the rescuers were now finding, shocked everyone involved in the operation. Some rescuers remarked that the faces of some of the deceased looked so peaceful, as if they were simply sleeping. This only deepened the tragedy of what had happened. Yet among the rescuers, there were those who doubted that the tragedy was caused solely by natural conditions. Discussions began to circulate that the group might have made mistakes in choosing their route, violated safety rules, or relied too much on their own strength. In the mountains, as everyone knows, even the smallest mistake can be fatal. The deadly silence that descended after the avalanche now surrounded the rescuers as well. Everyone knew that they weren't just dealing with a natural disaster, but with a series of tragic errors that had led to the deaths of almost the entire group. As the search operations continued, increasingly clear questions began to emerge. What had caused this tragedy? Rescuers, hikers, and mountaineers involved in the operation tried to make sense of what had happened. It became clear that the disaster had been caused not only by nature, but also by human error. Gradually, details emerged that indicated the group had made several fatal mistakes. The first mistake was the choice of route for the descent. The decision to leave the safe path they had ascended and take the pass proved fatal. This route hadn't been studied beforehand, and no one could have predicted that the snow conditions on the pass would be much worse than on the ascent. The more experienced hikers in the group may have underestimated the danger and failed to notice signs of an avalanche risk, loose snow and a sloping slope. The second critical mistake was the lack of discipline within the group. Although there were more experienced members who took on informal leadership roles, the group lacked a clear leader. As a result, no one ensured that the group maintained proper spacing between participants, which could have saved the lives of at least some of them. In an avalanche, prone area, maintaining distance is one of the key safety rules, but the young hikers didn't know or simply didn't pay attention to it. Another mistake was the neglect of equipment. The avalanche cords, which could have helped the rescuers locate the bodies faster, remained in the participants' pockets. These simple safety measures were ignored. No one had conducted a briefing before the ascent, and the novices in the group weren't prepared for emergency situations. This negligence, ignoring critical rules from the outset, ultimately cost the lives of most of the group members. When the bodies were found and brought down, doctors confirmed that all the victims had died from asphyxiation or hypothermia. The avalanche had been so fast that the hikers had no chance of saving themselves. Many bodies showed signs of struggling against the mass of snow, but most of them had died almost instantly. The pressure from the snow was so great that people didn't even have time to group together or attempt to dig themselves out. Gradually, it became clear that the tragedy could have been avoided if the group had adhered to basic safety rules. Rescuers, as well as experienced mountaineers involved in the operation, were shocked by how negligently the group had treated the potential dangers of the mountains. Hamar, Daban, though not the highest mountain range, was known for its unpredictable nature, and in 1985, it reminded people once again that the mountains do not forgive mistakes. When the search and rescue operation concluded, all the bodies had been found and brought to the city, and the entire country learned about the tragedy on Bhabha Peak. But the story didn't end there. The tragedy of 1985 became a source of pain, not only for the families and friends of the victims, but for everyone connected to mountaineering and mountain tourism. The group's mistakes became a lesson for many, but the mountains forever held on to this sad mystery in their snowy peaks. The memory of the lost students lived on among tourists and mountaineers. In the following years, hiking clubs and mountaineering sections began to pay more attention to safety. Daban and other mountain ranges in the eastern Sayans was no longer viewed as a simple hike. People began to think about the risks hidden behind every ascent and the importance of following safety rules and respecting the mountains. In memory of the students who died in the tour, a memorial plaque was erected at the foot of Hamar. Daban. Everyone who passed through these places stopped there, remembering those who had lost their lives in the mountains. The place where the avalanche occurred became a silent reminder of how easily the mountains can claim lives. For many rescuers and participants in the search operation, this tragedy left a deep mark. Some of them recounted how this story changed their approach to mountaineering and safety. Those who had directly participated in the rescue efforts still remembered how difficult it was to see young people frozen in the snow and feel helpless in the face of nature's power. However, despite all the pain and bitterness of this story, something more remained. A lesson that the mountains taught everyone involved in this tragedy and those who heard about it. The lesson that the mountains do not forgive mistakes and that every ascent should be approached with respect for nature, proper preparation, and strict adherence to safety rules. The memorials and stories of the students who died in the tour became an important reminder for future generations of mountaineers and tourists that even the seemingly easiest routes can turn into deadly dangers. The mountains, keeping their secrets, will always remind us of those who underestimated their power.